we have no real media in this state. Well, you have us.
It's really time for a parent revolution.
Never let a good crisis go to waste. That's what the left did with COVID in so many different ways.
Wind energy, especially offshore wind, is a big loser and just another government boondoggle.
Like, what's going on?
People are fed up. They lied to us then. They're lying to us now. They're assaulting our families.
What we do is we look at the lies of the left that they keep pushing out, that America doesn't work for black people. That is not true.
They want to now monopolize truth and say, truth is only what we say truth is. Damn the data, damn the science.
The key with science is it always needs to serve objective thinking. They just call anyone who challenges them a science deniers.
They're evil.
Shut up or we'll cancel you.
What we're going through is a cultural revolution.
This is big, and this is how change begins.
Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, welcome to the Ocean State Current Command Bunker. Now playing from in the dugout, number 37, Mike Stenhouse.
Does Rhode Island need a constitutional amendment to give further protection to the environmental rights of the people of our state? Is the larger question, is the net zero green agenda our state is already on, is that the path we need to further solidify or depart from? Hey folks, welcome to In the Dugout. Your host, Mike Stenhouse here. You know, that's the critical question here, whatever green policy, net zero policy, or otherwise fossil fuel policy, electric vehicle mandate, whatever it is we're talking about, they all need to be rolled up into the larger question. Is our state heading down the right path when it comes to our net zero strategies? And as our report recently showed, the staggering costs of that, the risks of that with brownouts and blackouts if green energy can't supply enough capacity on the increased electrification that a lot of people on the left want to see advocate for. Is that the path we want to stay on? If so, do we want to codify that via a constitutional amendment, codify that path and make it basically unconstitutional to veer away from that path? Or do we indeed, as we recommended in our report, do we need to take a step back and say, wait a minute, for way too little benefit, we're causing immense harm and costs on families and businesses, and maybe even on their own physical safety if we have blackouts on the coldest of winter nights. You've heard us use the term freezing in the dark. Our report said that's very possible. If we continue, according to us, now my guest, who you're going to meet in just a minute, is going to very much disagree, I'm sure. But do we continue down that path or do we backtrack away from that? That is the question here. That at the highest level, do we need constitutional amendments to further this agenda, or do we need to repeal and reform and back away from that agenda? That's the fundamental question at hand. But my guest, who you're going to meet in just a second, was instrumental and is behind efforts to get constitutional amendments passed in many states. It's already passed in 3 or 4 states. Rhode Island Senate recently passed it. We'll talk about the legislative process. We'll talk about the constitutional amendment process. And we'll talk about whether this proposed constitutional amendment to protect the environmental rights, I mean, what is a right? We're going to get into that as well, I'm sure. But we're going to talk about with my guest, the pros and cons, and I'm sure we're going to have a spirited debate because I'm sure we're not coming from the same side on this. So I think this will be fun. You might remember a few months ago, we had Senator Ilana DiMario on. She's a green energy, climate change activist, if you would. We had a really good debate. We didn't agree on hardly anything, but a really good discussion. And I'm thinking that this discussion with Maya Van Rossum is going to be similar. So let's find out right away and meet our special guest. So joining me now is, for all intents and purposes, the force behind this proposed constitutional amendment. She's the founder of the Green Amendment for the Generations Movement, and we welcome a rookie for the first time on In the Dugout, Maya Van Rossum. Maya, welcome to In the Dugout.
Oh, I'm so excited to be here. Thanks so much, Mike. And I didn't know I was a rookie, but I'll take it.
Yeah, well, that's the way it works in pro ball. You're either a rookie or a veteran or, whatever. Now I see you playing ball with us right away. You've got a jersey on. What do you have there?
So this is a Chiefs jersey. This is from the ice hockey team that's part of that really fun ice hockey movie. And my son and husband are great ice hockey guys. And so we actually watch this movie a lot. And I've got my cap. And my cap's a little bit of a mix. This is a picture of my friend Larry Stauffer, who sadly has passed away. But on his cap is a Flyers logo. And Larry was a big Flyers ice hockey fan. And so I thought that was the best I could do. So I got the Chiefs ice hockey and I got the Flyers ice hockey. And I got my friend Larry, who was a really great guy to boot.
You are coming to us from Pennsylvania, so it's natural you would be a Flyers fan, I guess, right?
Yes, absolutely. But more so my husband and my son, I have to be honest. They're the big ice hockey people, but both of them played ice hockey, so I really enjoy the sport.
Very cool. All right. You are founder of Green Amendments for the Generations. Tell us a little bit about that organization and maybe even just quickly your background and why you started this organization.
I will, but I'm going to remove my cap.
Okay,
so,
yeah.
Just because I'm not used to having a hat on.
Well, we want to see that blonde hair anyways. Those long locks, yeah.
There you go. So the Green Amendments for the Generations movement, it's a national movement, and it's about helping to inspire communities to want to secure and then helping educate them so that they can successfully advocate for a constitutional amendment that gets added to the state constitution and protects the right of all the people of the state to clean water and clean air, a safe climate, healthy environments, and the thriving ecosystems that are important to every aspect of our lives. And there are these kinds of amendments that already exist in 3 states, Pennsylvania, Montana, and the state of New York. And there is a Green Amendment proposal that's been put forth in Rhode Island. And while I appreciate your giving me, all the credit for Rhode Island, the truth is there's a whole community in Rhode Island that's working towards this effort that has put it forth. And I'm helping to educate them and lift them up and make sure they really understand the values and the benefits of this pathway.
All right, and before we get into the language and all that, let me just ask a little more background stuff. Do you have background in environmental issues or anything like that beforehand, or are you just kind of a concerned citizen who took some initiative?
Yeah, so I like to consider myself both, but actually I've been an environmental advocate and attorney for over 30 years. And so in addition to being the founder of the Green Amendments movement, I also am the leader of a 4-state organization called the Delaware Riverkeeper Network. I'm the Delaware Riverkeeper. And so I've been working to protect New York, New Jersey, Pennsylvania, and Delaware and the waters of the Delaware River watershed for all the values and benefits it provides to all the communities. And I founded the Green Amendment movement because of our successful use of an amendment of this kind that already existed in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania. And we utilized that amendment to help protect communities from industrial operations that would be harmful, energy, but also to protect the right of local municipal authorities to be able to continue to zone in order to best advance and protect their communities in terms of zoning where residents should be allowed to happen and industry should be allowed to happen, and trying to respect that there's a place and space for each of them.
All right, and just one more background question. And you mentioned you're an attorney. Is your practice largely in environmental law and related lawsuits on that, or is it something unrelated?
Yeah. So as the leader of the Delaware Riverkeeper Network and now Green Amendments for the Generations, I actually have attorneys on staff. So I don't do my own litigation. I am a licensed attorney. I'm licensed in 3 states, and I oversee the work that my attorneys do, as well as the work of my non-attorney staff. And it's really about advancing advocacy to get good government decisions and actions to help advance industry and development that's protective of the community while also advancing the goals of that business operation. And to the extent that litigation is value added, yes, I oversee the litigation, but I'm not the one in the courtroom. I'm the client, essentially.
I got it. You're the director. Okay. All right. So So here's how I like to do it. I'd like to just have the first segment be just you factually explaining the process, the language, the bill itself, where we are, why you think it's important, whatever you want. And then we'll go back and depending on what you say, I may challenge or ask or dig deeper on some of those things. But I want to give you first a chance just to have your story out there, unadulterated by me or anybody else, and then we'll have a little fun with it afterwards. Does that sound okay?
That sounds great. And I really appreciate that, Mike. And I think, to me, with regards to this issue, we can only ultimately end up on the same page because all of us need clean water and clean air to have happy, healthy lives, right? We all appreciate the beautiful environment that we get to recreate in and enjoy time with our family in, or quietly, fish or hunt or hike or whatever it is you do out in nature. And this green amendment that I'm going to talk about really is about protecting all of those values for everybody. And so even if we may disagree on perhaps the issue of climate change, you may have one perspective and I have another. This amendment is really about focusing on the fundamental right of all people to a clean, safe, and healthy environment. And that is not just about climate. If people believe there's no issue with the climate, then this amendment would have no impact on that issue, right? And we can focus on the clean water and the clean air and healthy environments aspects of that, because I think we all agree there are problems there.
I think you're right. When it comes to clean water, clean air, a pristine, beautiful environments, even concern. I'm sure we are conservatives. I'm not. I have no idea where you are. We could guess, but you'll tell us. It'll come through. But we all agree on that. You're right. And we just may disagree on how to get there. Okay. So here is your organization put out a media release on June 3rd, because earlier that day the Senate took the first step in getting to that constitutional amendment. Whether that takes the next step or not, we don't know. We'll see. That's yet to play out. But the Senate did pass the constitutional amendment. Here it is. The lead senator is Senator Susan Sosnowski, who I know and I've met. Did you work closely with Senator Sosnowski on this?
Well, she's taken the leadership role. And so, to some degree, we work with her, and I helped educate her and inform her and talk about the qualities of the language and different language options. But I like to be clear that, when it comes to these amendments in any state where I work, the real leadership role is by the legislative champions and by the people of the state that are advancing this. So I am an expert resource. I provide information, I provide assistance, I do talks, I educate people. But in the final analysis, it was really up to the senator and the people of Rhode Island as to what this amendment, how it would read. But what it accomplishes, I think, is what.
All right, before we go there, I just want education.
Yeah.
When we're looking at a bill, you're looking to amend an existing article, and just so people know that what's in blue is the proposed changes to that amendment. What you're seeing in black already exists in somewhere in state law or some regulation.
A little bit different than that, Mike. A little bit different. Okay, if I jump in?
Yeah, that's normally how they do it. Is this one different? Right. Go ahead.
Okay, so the opening and the closing are more of a descriptor of what is being proposed and how it's being proposed, and I think at the end it talks a little bit about the process. So what we see in the language, as you said, in black, is making clear that what this amendment seeks to do is to add to the Bill of Rights or Declaration of Rights section of the state constitution this new language. You want to amend Article 1. That's correct. And Article 1 is the part of the Constitution where all those other civil and political rights we hold dear, human rights we hold dear, are placed, like the right to free speech, freedom of religion, private property rights, the right to bear arms. Those fundamental cherished freedoms are all included in that Declaration of Rights section of the Constitution. And so what we're saying is that this inalienable human right of people to clean water and clean air and healthy environments would be placed in that section of the Constitution and be given that same highest legal standing as those other fundamental rights I described. So people understand how the right to free speech and private property rights are protected legally. Those same quality of protections would now come to bear for the rights to things like clean water and clean air.
So by whose definition of clean water, clean air are we relying on here? I mean, what standard is acceptable? What's not? I mean, that seems awful vague to me. How do we make that something that's actionable?
Yeah. So the way the amendment gets defined and applied is through the same process by which all those other fundamental rights are protected, right? So, people say, well, what does it mean to have a right to speak freely? Or what does it mean to be free from an unreasonable search and seizure? Like, how does unreasonable get defined, right? The way in our democratic system here in the United States of America, the way it works is the Constitution, particularly state constitutions, are we the people giving our state government officials guidance on how we expect them to carry out their duties as government officials, right? Sort of the rules of the road. And then what happens, so you tend to have broad overarching language in the Constitution so that you're giving that guidance in whatever area you're talking about. Here we're talking about the environment. Then the legislators pass legislation and they define unreasonable and freely speak, clean water, clean air, right? They give it definition in different contexts, right? So clean water, when you're talking about a company that might use forever chemicals, is going to be different than when you're talking about agricultural practices or development practices. So we have laws that get passed to define that term in all these different contexts.
And we have court decisions that further clarify.
Well, but the next step in the process, right? You're hopping over, right? There are a couple other steps. The next step is the legislators tend to tell the regulatory agencies. Now you've got to give even further definition because legislation also gives relatively broad guidance on what these rights mean in different contexts. But now we have to talk about specific situations. What does it mean to freely speak if you're walking into a movie theater versus if you're walking into a dugout? What does it mean, right, to have clean water when you're talking about a specific proposal in a specific location that already has pre-existing conditions? So then our regulatory agencies provide regulations, all of which have community participation. And then there's another step. I know you want to hop to the courts, but then individual companies come in, or businesses or operations, and they have to get a permit that, right, puts all the legislation and the regulation into practice for their specific facility. And they get their permit, and then they go into operation, or maybe they've just gotten their permit. And only then, if people that are being impacted by whatever that operation is, don't feel that, there's demonstrated evidence that that permit or that operation as proposed or as operating is having devastating consequences for the water, for the air, for the environment, then the people can go to court. And that's when the courts get involved in the same way they do with all those other fundamental rights we talk about.
We'll circle back to some of that later. And you're accurately defining the process of how, you take a broad constitutional or statutory concept, and then it gets developed and defined and refined, and guardrails or not put on it. Okay. But my question, don't we already have that going on? We have it at Department of Environmental Management. We have a lot of laws on the books. I'm not exactly sure what laws we have. We already, except for the constitutional provision that you're seeking to get, we already have all those other things in place, don't we?
There's a yes and a no to that. We have them, but sometimes in Rhode Island and everywhere, but in some contexts, we don't have them. So have you heard, Mike, about forever chemicals or PFAS?
No, I don't know those.
Okay, so if anybody in your audience, Googles out PFAS or Forever Chemicals, what you will find is this is a man-made family of chemicals. It's found in stain-resistant clothing and carpeting and food packaging, and for many, many years, it has been produced by industry and used in these materials and used in ways that has allowed PFAS to get into the environment and into soils, agricultural lands, into livestock, into drinking water supplies.
All right, but that's my point. Wouldn't DEM automatically, if somebody raised awareness, don't they have the authority to regulate that stuff? Why do we need a constitutional amendment?
That's my point. It's no, not necessarily, because there hasn't been in Rhode Island or in other states or at the federal level for literally decades, there was no legislation or regulation that addressed PFAS contamination. And so the regulatory agencies in Rhode Island, like other states, did not actually have the authority to take on that dangerous contaminant. And as a result, it is out in the environment, it's causing cancers, it's having impacts for children, for fertility, it causes testicular cancer, right?
But I still don't understand why we need a constitutional amendment to address that.
Because if you don't have a law in place and you don't have a regulation in place, so those regulatory agencies and government officials don't have the authority to address that dangerous contaminant, then the companies get to utilize it in all the ways they've utilized it to have this devastating consequence. If there had been this overarching constitutional right of the people to clean water and healthy soils, then when it became clear, when those companies came in, making clear they were going to use PFAS, when it became clear how dangerous PFAS was, those regulatory agencies could have actually said within these permits, you may not operate in this way, or you may not use this chemical. It would play out differently in different contexts, all the while giving time.
But I get it. But couldn't some person or some group sue right now under existing law if they had a specific? Why do we need this overarching monstrous umbrella? If we're just gonna sue on one little issue, can't somebody sue on that issue right now?
So a decade ago, before you had Rhode Island now is putting in place legislation and regulation, as are other states. But no, there was not that authority. So the kinds of legal action that could have been taken might have been against a specific company, which is very difficult and which would not have resolved the problem for all of Rhode Island, proactively avoiding all of the devastating economic and human health harms that are now plowing out for people across Rhode Island. But if there had been this constitutional right to clean water, then when there was not legislation or regulation, the people who were being impacted, whether they were business people, farmers, right, individuals, could have used the Constitution to go to their regulatory agency and say, we're being harmed by this contaminant. You must take action now. Then the regulatory agency could have taken action to stop the harm, and the legislators would have been like, holy crow, we're missing a whole boatload of problems. We need to come here and pass legislation.
All right, we're going to move on. You didn't convince me. I don't know why people just couldn't take that action right now if somebody was actually being harmed. We have a lot of provisions in place to make sure people don't get harmed by chemicals and pollutants and things like that. All right, so we're going to move on.
No, Mike, because we do have those. But the other context, there are those gaps. But there are many, many places and spaces where those existing laws, as they're being interpreted and applied, are not, in fact, protecting people. And so you do have people drinking contaminated water. We do have fish advisories. We do have devastating environmental consequences that are playing out across Rhode Island, where the laws, as written, interpreted, and applied in that context, are not working. And that's when people need to be able to turn to the Constitution and say, listen, in this context, this law is not working to protect our communities. They do go to court, they get a decision that then says to the government, you have to go back.
I hear what you're saying. I'm not convinced. All right, I hear what you're saying. We're going to keep going. All right, let's talk about the process. Then we're going to come back and debate some of these things. But I want to make sure everybody understands the process. So this bill passed the Senate, 32-4, I believe, with 2 no votes. The 4 Republican senators
Two
voted
not
against.
voting. No, it was 32-4. 2 didn't vote.
Right,
So
and 2 not
32
voting, right.
4 no, 2 not voting.
Right. Yep. And there is a similar bill that's been heard in committee in the House.
Correct.
That bill number, let me just get it right here. That bill number is 5732. It's on, you never know in Rhode Island whether the bill, once it has, all bills are held for further study, and then at some point leadership decides to move a bill forward and they'll put it up for a committee vote, then a floor vote. We don't know if that's going to happen. But it would have to pass the House. And I assume the governor would have to sign it.
No, that's
Not on a constitutional amendment? Okay.
on a constitutional amendment.
Okay.
The
So,
Constitution is about the people.
all right. So it passes the House, then it automatically will be put on some future ballot question where the people would have to vote to accept or not this recommended amendment to the Constitution. Is that a 50% or a 2/3 majority in the public vote?
Majority.
Just a majority. So it just needs 50 plus 1 vote, 50% plus 1 vote to pass. And that would be voted on presumably in 2026 elections, I would imagine, if it were to pass this year. Safe assumption?
Whenever I actually don't know when your next statewide,
Yeah, 2026. Yeah.
and that's
We have
when it
state-
will be on the
Yeah,
ballot.
probably.
Yeah.
All right. Have you done any polling in the state on this?
No polling.
Okay, so we have no idea how the public's going to react to any of this.
The polling, the public reaction is gauged through public participation in the process at these committees where there are hearings right before the legislators. And then, as you said, they get their opportunity to vote because the Constitution is the people's document.
Right. Okay. And we don't need a constitutional convention for that, a state constitutional convention. We can just vote on it as one constitutional amendment as a ballot question. So just to be clear on that process, do you have any indication from House leadership, Speaker Shekarchi or the majority leader, whether or not they are going to bring this to a committee vote?
No, I actually don't know at this time.
Okay. All right.
Certainly
All right,
hope
so that's-
because I just want to say, I mean, the thing is, it's so important to bring these things to a vote because that's what the process is. And the people, because this is a people's document, the people really should.
Well, in Rhode Island, it's more than that. If the leadership brings it to a vote, it passes the committee, it passes the floor. There has never been a bill in the 14 years I've been covering Rhode Island that has been shot down in committee or on the floor. They all pass because everybody does what the speaker wants. So that's just the way it goes. He won't bring it forward if he doesn't think it's going to pass. All right.
But can I just say, Mike, but you know what? That's a beautiful thing because when it comes to a constitutional amendment.
No, it's not a beautiful thing because the speaker shouldn't be the only person to determine whether something moves forward or not. They should have honest votes on committees, but you're not allowed to vote against it if you're a Democrat in this state. You're just not allowed to.
Well,
And
but
that's the fact.
That works both ways, right? I mean, you're talking about it in terms of people feeling compelled to cast their vote a certain way. But, the other way to look at it is there shouldn't be one person should not be entitled to prevent a vote altogether. And especially when we're talking about a constitutional amendment.
Well, then they should allow every bill to have a vote. And they don't.
Ultimately, well, and I,
Right, every bill should be treated the same then. I mean, I kind of agree with you. We're either going to have a democratic process or we're not. And right now we don't. We have in essence autocracy in our legislature. But that's Rhode Island. Yeah.
I hear, but it's
Go ahead.
Island is not so different in terms of this process and people misappropriating their power to prevent a vote from happening. I mean, we see that in a lot of
Happens
states.
that way too, yeah.
But when it comes to the constitutional amendment, the beautiful thing is that in the final analysis, it's not up to these single individuals. It really is up to the people of the state. And that's what's so beautiful about this. The people are the ones who are going to decide at that 2026 ballot if this passes through the entire process.
Well, we've put forth many proposed constitutional amendments that never even get a hearing. So again, it's very arbitrary and it's very dictatorial in my view. All right, let's go back now. All right. What you kind of alluded to it earlier with one specific case, but in a general sense, What is the problem that you perceive or see that this proposed constitutional amendment seeks to address? How would you define the problem?
Yeah. So the way I would define the problem, and there's a myriad of examples, so I have to use.
Now, I want a general. You
have places like Providence where you have contaminated air that's inducing asthma attacks, right? And heart disease. You have in other communities in Rhode Island, you have waterways that are so contaminated, people are not supposed to even swim in those waterways, where there are fish advisories limiting the ability of people to eat fish a certain number of times because of contamination, right? We have these very serious environmental conditions that communities are facing because when it comes down to it, in specific instances, there are many times when the laws as written and applied don't work. And so you need that extra constitutional guidance out of the courts and in the courts to say to the regulatory agencies, as you're interpreting and applying these laws, you must do so in a way that protects the environmental rights of the people. And so that is powerful and that's important. Now, that's my perspective. And there's a lot of evidence in communities. People just have to look at the press headlines to know. But if, Mike, you disagree with me and you say, all the laws in Rhode Island, environmental laws in Rhode Island, are working perfectly. So the environment is perfectly protected, as are the rights of people to clean water and clean air. Then you know what? No harm, no foul in giving this constitutional oversight to make sure it stays that way.
Okay, so if I were to reword it in my terms, trying to be as objective as I can on this, you do not believe existing laws, existing regulatory process, and existing, I don't know, we'll even say, legal or court procedures empower the people enough to be able to defend themselves about harmful pollutants in the environment. Would that be fair to say? And that this would give them extra recourse?
Yeah, there are many times when the laws as written and applied in a certain circumstance don't work. And in those circumstances, people need to have the tool to go back to their government and say, I have a right to clean water. The way you
explain that.
The water's becoming so contaminated, it's giving my child cancer. And that's not okay. And so I'm going to use the Constitution.
I can't believe we don't have the means to do that now anyway. I don't, again, that's a part of your argument. I'm not going to go to.
The reason, but it's important to understand this, right? To me as a lawyer, it's important that you understand that because the laws, if all the laws are being applied exactly as written, you can still have a problem. And because the laws are being applied exactly as written, they don't take into consideration things like—
You admitted earlier that this—
end up with harm, and then there's nothing to enforce, but there's nothing to enforce.
Yeah, but you admitted earlier this vague language in this bill is on purpose so that it still is subject to interpretation.
But
this doesn't really solve anything. It doesn't solve any. It just opens up more vagary.
Do you think that there's no value in having a right to bear arms or a right to free speech in the Constitution? Are you telling me that having that constitutional right hasn't made a difference for those fundamental freedoms?
I don't understand your point.
Well, my point is that when we talk about the right to free speech, when we talk about freedom of religion, when we talk about the right to bear arms, these also have this same situation. There are many times, places, and spaces where the laws as written work. And there are many times when they don't work. And that's why we continue to have legal challenges over those freedoms based on the constitutional language. So the Constitution in those areas that are so critical to us as Americans, it is the Constitution that has ensured that the inalienable rights of the people, that we the people do have recourse when our fundamental rights are being infringed upon. So I'm saying to you, you're saying, well, it's not going to make a difference. But what I'm saying to you, but look at it the other way. These other free speech, freedom of religion.
No. All right. So here's where I'm going to
need a difference for those fundamental freedoms. And you have the same circumstance for the environment. It just applied
to— It's not the same. It's not the same.
It's
not the same. It's not the same.
How is it not the same?
Well, I'll get into that. And this is one of my this is one of my pet peeves. And as a lawyer, this will be. I'm not a lawyer, so you're probably gonna be able to blow me away on this. But anyway, it's something that I've never gotten an adequate answer to. When you talk about environmental rights, the way that Rhode Island law and Rhode Island judges and regulators would interpret that is because we had a big debate about something called Roadmap Rhode Island 12 years ago, which basically enshrined the whole climate change agenda and sustainable living and all that kind of stuff. And we showed, and nobody cared in the government, we showed how it would necessarily infringe on property rights because property owners would not be able to do things with their land that we believe they should have the right to do. Dig a hole in the backyard, dig a well, whatever, not cut down a tree. So nothing in my view can be a right if it infringes on anybody else's right. Owning a gun does not infringe on anyone else's rights unless you use that maliciously. Talking freely does not infringe on anyone else's rights unless you incite violence with that or something like that. But the way environmental rights are interpreted and implemented, it's a severe restriction on property rights, on business rights, who have to comply with all these crazy codes just in order to open a business or build a building. So I don't believe it's the same thing because the kind of rights as I see it, correct me now, the kind of rights as I see it that you're talking about necessarily infringe on other rights. Go ahead.
You just made the argument that we should get rid of private property rights. And I'll tell you why.
Go ahead.
There are many, many times, right? And actually, you've also made the reverse argument for me in why this is so important. So there are many times when people undertake actions and activities on their own property, right? A big industrial operation that's spewing high levels of contamination into the air, right? Or the construction of a massive warehouse that's bringing in all this truck traffic through residential communities. And the person next door right now, and there are many examples in Rhode Island and across the nation, their property rights are being infringed upon by the pollution, by the noise, by the traffic. There are families who have been driven inside. They can't go outside their homes because of the high level of contamination from something that's happening on property next door, a development or industrial operation, or again, these massive warehouse projects. So their property rights, the homeowner's property rights, are being infringed upon by what's happening.
That's pretty specious. That's pretty specious, Maya.
And they're losing their property values. There are also many examples of people who have either the value of their property has been dramatically lowered, or even their capacity to sell their property has been prevented because a bank won't give a mortgage, for example, because a homeowner is located next to a fracking operation.
That's where local zoning comes in, right?
Now, but you see, now here's where it takes me back to the first example. In Pennsylvania, we had to use this amendment, as did 7 municipalities, to protect their zoning rights, their zoning authority, from a state law that preempted their zoning authority when it came to fracking, and actually mandated by virtue of state law that industrial fracking operations be allowed to happen with well pads located as close as 300 feet from people's homes. So they were infringing on property rights. They were stripping away local municipal zoning authority in order to say, bring your industrial operation to our town, that's fine, but it goes with all the other industries. It doesn't go 300 feet from people's homes. Because of Pennsylvania's Green Amendment, we the towns, able to challenge that law, get the zoning authority of the municipalities restored, the property rights and the residential safety and sanctity of those communities protected. Because in that
that's not the only consideration.
No, there are multiple.
Do you know that those laws are prohibiting fracking or the distribution of natural gas, especially into New England? New York is blocking it. Pennsylvania's got roadblocks as well. That every citizen in Rhode Island has to pay exorbitantly high costs for the natural gas we have. So there's such a thing called economic rights too. So there's a balance
What
between
about
all
the
this.
economic? What about
So
the
we should
economic
have
rights
an
of the property
we
owner,
should
Mike?
have an economic constitutional right as well then.
Yes,
That our
and you know
economic
what?
rights shall not be infringed upon.
And when
You see
we
what I mean?
get
You can't
we can, but
put
you're
one so important that it supersedes everything else.
No, but you keep asking me for specific example, and I keep giving them, and then you say, "Well, that's one example." But these
well,
are
what example?
these
Well, I'm not
are
saying well to anything.
representative of what's happening, and we also have to remember, right? When we're talking about drinking water, we have had drinking water contaminated by hazardous waste sites, by industrial operations, by PFAS contamination, and it has
Agreed.
and those have all been inflicted by industrial operations operating under existing law. And we, the people, economically have had to pay to clean that up because the laws as written didn't prevent that harm or hold those companies accountable. If you have the Constitution, in those circumstances, we can prevent that harm, which prevents that economic burden on all the taxpayers and the local property owners. So it really does go.
We've had
you have to
toxic
look at both
sites.
sides.
We've had toxic sites cleaned up, exposed, businesses shut down or fined or whatever under existing law. So again, I'm
Sometimes,
not
but not
understanding
every
why
time.
we need to do it, why we need to duplicate this effort.
But it's not, but yes, many times, but not every time. And in those instances, when the laws don't work, people are getting devastatingly harmed, right? They have, their kids are being harmed. They're being harmed. They're losing their lives, their livelihoods. They can't go to work and earn a living because they're suffering from an asthma attack or a heart attack because of pollution that's been allowed to be spewed into the air under existing law. That's not fair or right. And the Constitution says—
It's not allowed to be. It's not allowed to be.
It is allowed.
When it's exposed, it's dealt with.
That's not true. Under the law, state law, federal laws say everybody, you know, the way they're written, you get a permit to emit this level of pollution. The problem is sometimes that's fine if you have one operation, two operations, or three operations, but sometimes you have a community that's already surrounded by 10 operations. And when 5 more come along, they're devastated, but the law says those 5 additional operations are okay because they ignore what's already there. So if the laws are operating perfectly, Mike, then you should not be opposed to this because their laws are operating perfectly and this won't have any impact. But
What I'm opposed to is environmental rights becoming seen as the same as other rights or superseding other rights. That's what I'm opposed to.
You don't think that you or your family or your friends should be able to have the right to know that you can go out and play in a local stream and not get sick, that you can get a glass of water that isn't filled with toxic contamination from the environment, that you can go outside and have a party in your backyard.
No one's arguing against that.
Right?
Nobody is arguing against that.
But those are—
This doesn't. We already have protections. That's my point.
But we don't. But my point is we don't.
We have a climate change agenda in this state that is our organization has just in the last year issued reports that are showing the staggering costs and restrictions and dangers of our existing green energy policies. Our net zero policies are going to cause massive costs. They're going to cause massive grid unreliability. It's dangerous if the grid goes down on a sub-zero night in Rhode Island, people will die. I think they have a right to live. And I just see this as furthering all those staggering costs and risks, because now you're giving the green energy or the net zero advocates even more weapons to put more restrictions and costs on the people around. So let me ask you this first.
No, wait a second.
Let me ask you this first.
No, you don't get away with that. When you're talking about people dying, getting sick, dying, and losing their economic vitality, I can paper you up and down.
Well, they shouldn't die from the things you talk about either.
Exactly.
They shouldn't.
It is, and that is why it is a human right that should be recognized in the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution, so that people can't die from pollution and contamination, lose their—
It's okay if they die from blackouts.
That is not the comparison that we're talking about.
Well, if you can say if this, why can't I say if that?
Because you already said this, and so I said the same thing to you. But what the Constitution requires of our government officials and the courts and everybody is, yes, it requires balancing. But right now, you have property rights up here, which includes
We already have an imbalance in our state. You want to tip the scales even more with this amendment.
Because right now you have property rights up here and environmental rights are nowhere on the scene. Now with a Green Amendment, property rights and environmental rights, which also include a facet of property rights, and health and safety and the right to life are placed on equal footing. So when government governs, they must balance and protect both.
Okay, I would agree with you on that. All right. Let me ask you this sort of fundamental higher level
Now
question.
that I got you agreeing with me, I'm going to take off my jersey.
Oh, no. Oh, okay.
It's got too hot here. This is
All
a
right,
really
just-
it got too hot here. And I promised you before the show to the audience, I promised before the show, when I got too hot, I had to take my jersey off because it's really hot where I am.
All right, let it be noted, Adam, put a special star at this spot. This is the first time we have somebody disrobe on our show. But thankfully you did it tastefully. Okay. Let me ask you this. So I look at, I don't even know what the umbrella term would be. Environmentalism. I'll just use that term. It might not be the right term. There's two components. There's pollution, the environment, clean water, clean air, safe drinking water, all, clean ground and soil. And then there's climate change, reducing, carbon emissions into the air out of fear of an existential threat. And I see those as sort of separate, even though they're often under the same umbrella. It sounds to me like you're clearly talking about the first part, the pollutants, clean air, clean water, clean earth, all that. Is there also a climate change, net zero carbon component to all this?
So I'm just looking at the actual language right now. So yes. So I just wanted to confirm that my recollection was correct because different states do it differently. But yes, climate is in there. And even if climate wasn't in there, the right to a clean, safe, and healthy environment necessarily has implications for the climate. But what I've really wanted to stress, Mike, for you and for your audience is we don't have to, if you disagree with me about climate change, okay, there's something valuable and important here for those who want to have a difference of opinion on that. But yet recognize that their children should be able to go to school and have a clean, healthy, safe glass of water, right? There's so much in this that is about protecting every facet of our lives that we all can agree upon. And that's what I'm trying to focus on. But yes, climate gets addressed here. Now it's not net zero. It doesn't tell you how to get there.
Right.
Again, it's got to go through that legislative and regulatory process, which is where you, as a person in Rhode Island, gets the opportunity to go to your legislators and regulators and say, you know what, when it comes to climate, this is what our opinion is on it. We're already there. We don't need you to do this, that, or the other thing. And it provides, this doesn't dictate one or the other. So you still have that entitlement.
All right. So here's why I try to tie these together. Mm-hmm. We've been involved in two recent reports, our organization, that based on gold standard studies and other irrefutable research, as well as commentary from our own Rhode Island Energy, commentary from ISO New England, who is the regional energy appropriator, and as well as from our Public Utilities Commission. So research as well as statements of admission from these organizations that Rhode Island's current net zero decarbonization strategy will put us on the path that does not have the technological capacity to fulfill, that will be enormously costly to ratepayers, and will be enormously dangerous because if we try to go green or go electric, I should say, with everything, and if we try to just rely on green power, that we are going to be facing serious risks of brownouts and blackouts. We are asking the state to backtrack on those until the green energy programs are market friendly, are more affordable, are more reliable and abundant, and not put these costs and risks on our population. So my concern would be a constitutional amendment like this will make it even less likely, because now they'll get sued if they try to back away from these unreasonable demands. Now they can get sued under this constitutional amendment, and we will have no chance to get our state on a reasonable path towards a clean environment that we all want, but let's do it in a reasonable way that balances economic, property rights, and environmental concerns. So that is my concern. We are already down this path. I'm trying to have the state reverse course. We believe your bill will push us further down the path we're already on. Your thoughts?
Yeah. So couple of thoughts, and I appreciate your sharing that. So I disagree with you on, the implications of climate and climate change and what the science says about the reality of that, but that's okay because a couple of things. First off, to the extent that, and climate change itself and how it manifests for the water, for the air, for the intense heat, right? All these things has also very severe costs.
What intense heat?
And their health and their safety.
What intense heat?
What intense heat? Oh, if you go to many, it's getting hotter and hotter. I am very hot where I am, but you go and talk with workers who have to work out.
Wait a minute, according to what?
It gets into
not according to the studies I've read. What studies are you looking at?
Okay, I'll send you those studies. I don't have. Right. There are plenty of studies that talk about.
I'll have Adam put them in after the fact. Okay.
When we look and when you look for the last several years, we have exceeded
intense heat.
Temperature.
Intense heat.
Yes, intense heat.
Different than we had 50 years ago.
Yes. And year over year, the last 3, 4, 5 years, the level of heat has been hotter. We've been breaking records year over year. And for outside workers, construction workers, road workers, agricultural workers, they're the ones working out in this intense heat, and it's having very severe consequences for their health and their ability to work. I see you laughing, but that's okay. So, because
I had a guest on last week who said the little extra heat and the little extra carbon is actually good for agriculture, good for the planet, and helps us feed more people and helps us grow more plants and trees.
We're not talking about a little more heat or a little more
1 degree Celsius.
That is not what we are talking about. Very intense heat. And when you go in different places and spaces across the US and across the nation where that intensity, it's like everything, right? Like when you go right now, the temperature where you are is different from where I am, but the manifestation of climate change on the temperature may be net raising it for both of us or manifesting different in that location. But here, the heat is rising. And for those who work outside, that is intense. And so whoever is saying to you, blanket writ large in all circumstances, all is right, because of climate change, that is somebody who is being dishonest and misleading. And I don't appreciate somebody that's comes on as a guest of yours and is misleading with the audience. But I also want to say, because you put a lot of things out there, when we talk about fossil fuels, right, and trying to not just extend the life of fossil fuels, but continue to expand fossil fuel use. The fossil fuels are not just releasing climate changing emissions, but there's hazardous air emissions that are coming out and particulate matter, right? Air emissions that deeply impact the health of people who live nearby. So set aside the climate issue, the air pollution issue, and what it means for lives and bodies is serious and significant. What it means for water quality. And clean water isn't only needed by people, but when we're talking about businesses, there are many businesses right now, they need pharmaceuticals, they need clean water, energy purveyors, they need clean water. And often they're being faced with a circumstance where they have to pay millions of dollars to clean up the water, their water source, in order to be able to utilize it.
All right, those arguments aside, my goal here in bringing it was to try to understand where you're coming from. Like I said, I put two. Are you coming from?
One more important point, Mike.
You can make it. You can make it in response to this. Are you, because you focused your testimony, even though the word climate's in there. When you first started, until I asked you about it, you focused on clean air, clean water, clean land. All that kind of stuff. But now we've been talking about climate change. So, in your view, your personal motivation for wanting this is it to address both of those equally, climate and environment, or is it really focused more on environment and we're just having an argument on climate on the side?
They're all interconnected. And in my role as an environmental advocate and attorney, somebody who has worked with communities that have faced all of these ravages, the impacts of stormwater runoff and contaminated runoff into the water and direct pollution discharges and air releases and the devastation of the natural ecosystems important to their families or their business. I've been doing this work for over 30 years, and I have sat with these people in their kitchens, in their homes, in their communities, and witnessed, heard, and listened to, what are the ramifications. And each of these facets of the environment, when it is desecrated, right? When we're exceeding what is appropriate, what can support the environment and support the people, the consequences are different. And so they all need to be addressed, in my opinion. So I don't favor.
All right. So you talked about.
I favor them all.
All right, so you talked about devastation of the ecosystem. Let's take offshore wind, the whales that are washing up on our shores, the blade that fell into the ocean and all the pieces of toxic fiberglass and everything else and shards washing up on our shores, the dolphins washing up, the pounding in the ocean, the visual pollution of these hundreds, if not thousands of windmills off of our shores. Is that not devastation of our ecosystem?
So what the Green Amendment does, right, when we're talking about the implications of a proposal, whether you're talking about a law, like the law I talked about in Pennsylvania, or whether you're talking about a specific project, whether it's a wind turbine or a fossil fuel operation, what the Green Amendment does is it makes sure constitutionally that the government officials that are having to review and approve that project or disapprove that project have looked at all of these implications. And when they're looking at these implications, now they have to look at property rights. They also
where does it say that? Where does it say that?
So this is part of how the Constitution works. The way it says it, because government officials are constitutionally right. There are two ways that it says that.
It doesn't. First of all, it doesn't say it.
No,
right?
you can't. No, it does say it.
It does say it. Where does it say property rights shall be respected?
You have because property rights are also in the Bill of Rights section of the Constitution. And so they also have to be protected. That is why the government officials have to look at all of the Constitution.
But they don't.
But they do.
They don't. In this state, they don't. In this state, the lawmakers and the judges don't give a shit about property rights or economic rights. They just care about the green agenda. That's it. That's the way it works in our state. That's why our state is in such bad shape.
I can't agree with you.
They don't care about those.
I've seen.
They don't care about Second Amendment rights. They don't care about those rights.
When it comes to the environment, you're acting like protecting the environment has no economic value, no property. It has tremendous value.
Of course it does.
Billions of dollars.
Of course it does.
To the state coffers and local coffers, local communities, because of the.
But not to the exclusion of other rights.
To protect the healthy environment. Property rights have been protected because they have been trying to protect the environment. But there are places and spaces when the environment isn't getting proper protection. And right now, it's not included in that balancing. But I want to take you back to your point. This presumption that if you have this Green Amendment, that all fossil fuels are going to be shut down. And that's immediate. That's what I heard you say, sort of this perception that we're going to just like have this wave of shutdowns based on the passage of the
we're going to have a wave of litigation. That's for sure.
But now you have two things that are false. So number one, when you look at Pennsylvania, whatever it is I think about it, in the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, you still have fossil fuel extraction at a very high scale. But what you have because of Pennsylvania's amendment is you do now have that those operations are being increasingly expected to do a better job in terms of environmental protection and respecting their neighbors. So we can prove that the passage and implementation of a Green Amendment does not result in that sort of whole cloth shutdown. And there's a Democratic governor, right, in the office in Pennsylvania. That's number one. Number two, when it comes to litigation, demonstrably, we can prove that you don't have an onslaught of litigation. First off, there are 0 cases that have ever been brought based on a Green Amendment that have been dismissed as frivolous. So the claim that I hear, not from you, but from others, that this is going to result in frivolous litigation is demonstrably false, because there are all sorts of other things that prevent frivolous litigation. But also, when we look at the 3 states where we have a Green Amendment, there are some administrative challenges that get handled at that low level. But when you look at the number of cases that make it into the courts, on average, it is 3 to 10 a year. That is not massive litigation.
Well, in this, well, that remains to be seen. A lot of people are concerned about that. The fact that it didn't happen in one state, I don't know that that means anything, but it's evidence. I'll give it to you. It's evidence. Okay.
And by the way, every single one of those cases, when you look at the claims, there are a multitude of claims. Once the Green Amendment became, viable within the state, it may have been added to help either as a freestanding claim or to help inform the interpretation of existing law. But all of those legal cases, save for maybe 2, would have been pursued anyway. And that's demonstrated by the number of claims that you have there.
All right. You talked in your press release, you talked in your written testimony to the Senate committee, environmental equity and environmental justice. What do those mean? I've never understood what those mean, so please enlighten me.
Yeah, when we're talking about equitable protection of the water and the air, it means that we're all entitled to clean water, clean air, a safe climate, and the protection of those natural resources. And by the way, that trustee language, that is the other place where you have, by virtue of trust law, the obligation to engage in that informed decision-making, to do that analysis. I told you it was in 2 places, so that's one of the places. But whether you're talking about socioeconomics, whether you're talking about the color of somebody's skin, whether you're talking about rural communities versus suburban communities versus urban communities, what equitable protection means is that government officials, when they're doing their work, right, have to work to protect the environmental rights of all people. And so they can't say, oh, well.
But why does the bill have to mention race, ethnicity, gender, or social and economics? What the hell does gender have to do with the environment?
Well, actually, you do have, there is demonstrated science that women and children, right, and so here gender women, tend to be more deeply impacted by environmental pollution and degradation. When we talk about color, there is.
So how would you craft the policy? How would you craft the policy to amend that?
Well, we've done it. So now when government officials are doing their work, they have to work to make sure they're not disproportionately impacting any of those facets of the community. There is plenty of evidence in Rhode Island and across the nation.
Women live everywhere.
Black, brown, indigenous communities are more deeply exposed to environmental pollution and contamination. There's also evidence that poorer communities and rural communities, right, tend to be more burdened by environmental pollution and contamination because they tend to be disregarded. That's just demonstrable. And and it's important. And if you say, you know what, Maya, that's not a thing, then I say to you, okay, great, it's not a thing. So what's the harm in mentioning it?
I'm just asking why. Why is that? Why is that the case that these underprivileged communities or women suffer more environmentally than anybody else? Why? Why would that happen? What occurs that makes that, if it's a fact, makes it a fact?
Yeah, because you don't have the law that's requiring the consideration of what are existing conditions. So you do have, when we look at indigenous communities, for example, we do have that historically, they have been disproportionately targeted. And I'm not going to ascribe somebody's targeted
or disregarded.
Targeted, disregarded, exposed, whatever the reason or the rationale, the reality is, in the final analysis, they have higher exposure levels to environmental pollution, contamination, and harm. And so what this says is if there's going to be another industrial operation that's going to be foisted on their community, this amendment requires the government officials to do the work to make sure that they don't continue to get disproportionately impacted. And if somebody says to me, whether it's you or your audience, and you say, Maya, that's not true, Indigenous communities haven't been more deeply or exposed at higher levels to pollution and contamination, then again, I say, okay, so what's the harm in saying it? If it's not a thing, it's not a thing.
Because it's going to allow our state to the legal cover to advance an agenda that is killing our state. That's why that's the harm. So that's my thought. All right, let's talk about economically. Last area, do you have just, you've been so generous.
I can do a few more minutes. I'm getting texts all over the place.
All right, 2 minutes.
You
claim there'll be a positive economic development. You say enhance economic development. I believe that in countries like in Europe, Germany, Spain, they're backtracking all of this because it's harmed their economies. Higher restrictions on building, on businesses, that you have to have this more expensive heater or whatever it is, and all these extra inspections. Yeah, it might create a few jobs over here, but we've seen really not that many. Why do you believe this will not cause further economic devastation to our state?
Yeah, well, because we can see by the evidence. First off, we've already talked about and we've already agreed that when we have high quality environments, it's a tremendous economic driver for the state, billions and billions of dollars, as well as jobs, as well as taxes for state and local coffers.
We have that now.
And that will continue.
People come here out of tourism now.
And we will, but if you don't have, if you don't have the Green Amendment, like it's where I said, that's the if we don't have the Green Amendment, right, we are going to see continue.
And if conditions get intolerable, but they're very tolerable right now.
What we also see is that we can see this over history, that actually when you look, for example, at the Clean Air Act, that was a tremendous economic driver, because what you're doing is you're requiring new technologies, new strategies, new construction practices, new tools and mechanisms and environmental pollution strategies that do all, right? Somebody is making those. There's a new company that's developing those. So you don't.
I'm all for that. I'm all for that.
Also, but that is how, when we talk about clean energy versus solar, wind, renewables versus fossil fuels, it is demonstrated across the board. You create 3 to 5 times the number of jobs. And they're not temporary construction jobs like you see when a fossil fuel operation or a fracking operation comes in, where they have all this hustle and bustle and then everybody goes away. These are enduring long-term jobs. And they also create a greater opportunity for workers to come in, right, at the beginning stages, to learn the business and to move on up to higher levels of pay. So we can actually see, you do actually create economic vitality by protecting the environment, by creating the jobs and the economic vitality in the way I just described, and by avoiding the economic harm from the health consequences, the emergency services that are required to respond to growing flooding or flood damages or droughts that come, or some sort of a weather disaster. You avoid the costs on the local community to have to pay $3 million to hook up to a different water source, which is very expensive for people. So
those are all very interesting claims. I've never seen solid research to indicate any of that's true. It's a fear, it's a claim. You can send me the stuff if you like, but I know you have to go. So let me just say what a great sport you are. I want to thank you for your spirited debate here today, and for playing ball with us with your jersey and your cap. You're a really good sport. You probably put me to shame on a few things. I hope I gave you a few things to think about as well. But again, I want to thank you so much, Maya, for your time today and joining me in the dugout. And guess what? You're no longer a rookie.
All right, Mike, I appreciate that. And I just want to say how much I appreciate and respect you, because this was a fun conversation. It was a positive conversation. And I didn't feel like, this was not a gotcha. As you said, this was a spirited discussion. I didn't even consider it a debate. And I just hope, I really do believe in this. And so whether we, whatever we think about some of these aspects, I really, really, really believe in the value of this for helping to protect the people of Rhode Island. So thanks for giving me the opportunity to share that with your audience.
Maya Van Rossum, I wish you good luck and Godspeed, and thank you again. And we thank you, our viewing audience, for tuning in today. You know what? I think that was so much fun. We'll have to have her back on at some future point. So, hey, for In the Dugout, until next game, we'll see you then. Mike Stenhouse out.